Nevertheless, we're right here to our study, and I'm excited to continue. I thought we were going to finish Ruth tonight, but because we did chapter 2 at a go, and then we did chapter 3 at a go, and now we get into chapter 4, and there's just so much in there. We're going to need 2 weeks to finish, which it's not like we're in a great, plaguey rush. Was anybody just really excited to get out of the book of Ruth? I didn't think so. It's been a fun study indeed. And it's funny because I talked to my friend Jeremy Thomas. He's a pastor out, and he used to be the pastor of Fredericksburg Bible Church in Texas, and now just moved up to Spokane Bible Church, where he's Fredericksburg. Yeah, outstanding. And he's also on Grace Global Radio, and a board member of Schaefer with me. He's just a good friend. And he is a good friend and a great Bible teacher. And I said, we were just exchanging texts, and I said, I'm excited because I get to teach through Ruth. He said, I just finished Ruth a couple months ago, and I can't stop thinking about what a wonderful and exciting book it is. And he gave me this quote. This is my first time quoting a theologian by text message. But I did want to share it with you because I thought he had such a great insight. He said, the primary significance of the book of Ruth is not found in Boaz as a kinsman redeemer who typologically represents Jesus, nor does it center in the loyal actions of Ruth to Naomi or the adversities of Naomi being resolved in the Lord, but in the Lord's faithful rewarding the practical righteousness of Ruth and Boaz by his providential guiding of their lives to bring about an offspring that would ultimately give rise to David, the man after God's own heart, who had Moabite blood running through his veins, thereby signifying blessings available to the whole world through the one that would ultimately come from David, the Messiah. So that's Jeremy on the one side. I'm on the other side. I thought that was such a great picture, again, because one of the things that we've kind of argued with and struggled with is that this book has such an incredible precedence of being taught as some kind of love story. And we can understand why. As Bible teachers, everybody's trying to make the Word of God accessible and engaging and entertaining. And rom-coms or romantic movies are kind of one of the major themes in film, that in books and in cinema that draw people in. You add to that or compile upon that the fact that most studies of Ruth tend to happen within the context of women's Bible studies, right? Like whenever you start a women's Bible study, you start by studying Ruth, and then you study Esther, and then you're out of luck. You have to just study the Bible like a normal Christian. But and so that, I think, has also, and again, in a desire to appeal to at least the perceived tastes of most ladies, there's been sort of a sense of wanting to make it out to be that. But really, we want to see that what the book of Ruth encapsulates, as we see here, is God's sovereign care over his plan, over his people, over what's going on. And so that's why we want to kind of take a step back and not try to view this through the realm or the lens of just a love story. So we look at letting go, is what I want to call this. Naomi and Ruth, of course, we're just summarizing the whole book up to date. Hopefully, you've heard this. Most of you have heard this so many times, it's boring. So just take a nap for the next slide and then come back in a minute. Naomi and Ruth were in a bad way because of Naomi's and Elimelech, her husband, ironically named Elimelech because his name means God is king, and yet he was actually acting in disobedience to the rulership and the authority and the sovereignty of God by the authority of God by leaving Israel in the time of discipline. And so the result of that, so not only did they move to Moab, which is a place that they weren't meant to move towards, they were meant to stay in the land and encounter God and suffer, go through the discipline so that the land would return to God, and as God's plan is. And they ran away to Moab and married the two sons, Chilion and Machlon, married Moabite women, and everybody died, which is a bummer. Elimelech dies first, and that's the first kind of wake-up call to the family. It's not that every situation, particularly dramatic situations, are always the movement of God in our lives, but God does move through our circumstances. That is absolutely a common thing in our lives, that the Lord speaks to us, works through our circumstances to bring us to where he wants us to be. So Elimelech died, and they said, we'll just hang out here. And so Naomi and Machlon and Chilion continued on as in in Moab for another 10 years, after which the boys die, and then Naomi was really destitute. Thanks so much, Mike. Naomi was really hurting at that point and decides to run away back home, and Ruth decides to stay with her. We went, of course, through all that drama, because, of course, Naomi didn't want to go home with these two Moabite women as evidence that they'd been that disobedient. Because of all the nations surrounding, Israel was particularly commanded not to marry into the Moabites because of their history together. And so Naomi and Ruth are in a really rough way. Two impoverished widows, two women in a world that is never kind to single people and to bereaved people, but most particularly to these two women in this case. And we saw that while they were in a bad way, they returned home, and Naomi was ashamed, but Ruth shows the initiative. She had hope. She went out and said, let me please go save our lives by gleaning, by taking what the Lord provides for people in just such a situation as ours, so that we can be provided with food and not die, and even perhaps Boaz, who is a close relative, will take up our cause. And we saw that Boaz responded positively, so positively, in fact, that he basically gave her the freedom not just to glean, as any other impoverished person would be allowed to do, but in fact virtually provided for her, let her be amongst all the people of his family and his workers, and yet be doing so and reaping for her own benefit. Right? It was an incredibly generous move, but it was an incredibly generous move that left her with her independence and her freedom. He left her with the ability to make whatever such decision that she would make with her life. He undoubtedly knows, as we're going to see, his close relationship to them, that he could be the kinsman redeemer, but he doesn't want to, at least from what we looked at, it doesn't seem like he wants to put undue pressure on her because he's an older guy. He doesn't want to put pressure on this young Moabite woman to choose him, to go with him, unless it's something that she wants. And of course, when Boaz responds positively, Naomi gets excited. She kind of pulls out of this depression or sadness, and she gets on board, and she hatches this crazy plan. And we saw it was a crazy plan. It's not like there was some sort of social custom in the day that you'd sneak on, like if you really liked a guy, you'd sneak onto his working floor at night and uncover his feet. That wasn't an established custom. That wasn't something that was meant to happen. It wasn't something that was normal. But we saw that was kind of Naomi's striking, shocking, unusual, and creative plan to get Boaz's attention, so that Ruth could come before Boaz and say that I do want you to redeem us. I do want to be married to you, in essence. And so that wonderful encounter we looked at last night, we saw how Boaz went so far out of his way to protect Naomi, to protect Ruth, to protect her in her reputation. You know, he had her stay with him safe that night, and then at a safe distance, and then took her up early in the morning before anyone would see her, and told everyone, don't tell anyone you saw Ruth, and then sent her off with just an obscene amount of barley, right? An obscene, probably well over 30 times what she would have needed for any given day, much less, again, for perhaps some weeks of time. So Naomi's on board and hatches this plan. Ruth faithfully, humbly, lovingly executes on this plan, and it works out, and you can feel that palpable excitement as things go right for once, right? Naomi and Ruth, again, because of the unfaithfulness of Elimelech and Naomi, are in this really horrible, hard situation. But for Ruth, this is the best thing that could possibly happen, because in spite of all the difficulties, she is now closer to the living God, to the God of Israel. And that was what really drew her into wanting to be with Naomi. She wanted to know this God that was so differed from all the pagan gods and goddesses and all the other grotesque man-made religion that had plagued her life. She wanted that God who created her. She wanted to know that God who meant life. So for Ruth, it's easy to understand how she was still excited to be there, and she's showing this wonderful humility and love for Naomi and faithfulness to Naomi, and she's also above board. So Boaz said that he was going to take care of it. He was going to take care of it, so she didn't have to worry about it. And even Naomi, when Ruth comes home, says, "It's good, my daughter, that you go out with this young woman. People do not..." Oh, sorry, wrong one. at the end. It says, sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will turn out, for the man will not rest until he has concluded the matter this day. So Ruth hopefully gets to go in and take a nap, because I'm sure she didn't sleep as well as she could have. And Boaz goes about his business, and Ruth and Naomi seem to be willing to wait. Now, just a little practical point here. Ladies, when a man says that he'll do something, he'll do it. He doesn't need to be reminded every 6 or 8 months. He will do it eventually. and that's a little tongue-in-cheek. But the reality is that, oh no. So the reality of the matter is, though, is that they were able to, because of the character of Boaz, trust in, put their request before him, put their need before him, and then trust that he was going to do the rest. They'd done everything they can, and they were going to trust the rest of Boaz, which is, in a sense, for their sake, trusting in the Lord. And it just makes me think of kind of a side application, is that most of life, in fact, much of life, is doing the best that we can, doing what we're able to do, affecting the things we're able to, and then patiently waiting on the Lord to see what his will would be. And it reminds me of this powerful verse in Psalm 27:14. It says, wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. As the great theologian Tom Petty tells us, the waiting is the hardest part. Very frequently. It was Tom Petty, right? Think so? Okay, good. The point is that we all struggle most or suffer the most to just wait on the Lord. It's far more difficult to me, anyway, to be on the edge of not knowing what's going to happen, of what the Lord might do or what might or might occur, than it is to be going through the trial, right? To use an example from life recently, it was far worse looking over the ridges and seeing far worse looking over the ridges and seeing the glowing possibility of the fire coming over and destroying Fort Collins, right? Than it would actually be if it were to happen. Right? If it were to happen, we'd figure it out, we'd get in our cars, we'd take the things we needed to take, and we'd move on and move out. But just sitting there wondering, should I pack a bag? Can I go to sleep tonight? Are we really safe? Right? Can be far more difficult. Right? So in other words, the suffering over the anticipation of the trial is often worse than the trial itself. And in this case, I think it behooves us to recognize that most of our life is going to be waiting, not knowing what's going to happen. What we do is we do our due diligence, we do the best, and then we trust and wait on the Lord to provide whatever the next step will be, whether that's joy or suffering, trials or difficulty. We are not going to make it any better by worrying about it. Or as the Lord would say, who of us by worrying could change even the single color of a hair on your head? You're not changing anything by worrying. And so I admit very freely that we're reading into the text a little bit here, but between Naomi and Ruth's conversation at the end of chapter 3, I see two women with hopeful hearts taking a restful morning in celebration that someone else had taken up their cause. And I think we can take that attitude absolutely every single day, on the edge of every single trial, if we choose to wait on the Lord. That's a healthy attitude for us to take. Anyway, so we see in our verses here, Boaz goes up to the gate. It says, and Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, come aside, friend, sit down here. So he came aside and sat down. So why does Boaz go up to the gate? Again, not probably a common thing for us today, but the gates of a town had lots of function. First of all, they were, of course, meant safety, security, and protection. And we've mentioned this before, but this is the first time or one of the rare times in human history where you don't have to worry if the people of the neighboring village are going to come over as marauders in the nighttime and steal all your pigs. Or whatever. Probably not in Israel. They wouldn't steal their pigs. If they did, take the pigs. We can't eat them anyway. But whatever it is, gates meant security. If you were within a walled city, then you knew that at least your person would be safe in the night. Gates also were a place where business was conducted. It was the place where people would gather, do their buying, do their selling. The marketplace in these small towns would often be around the gates. Gates were the place for public discussion. Right, so these small communities would meet together to discuss whatever the matters of the day were at the gates. And finally, the gates were the place where legal decisions were made. Now, We're used to kind of all of our governmental structures, local and federal and all the like, but most of the decisions in these ancient Israelite communities would have been made by the elders, kind of the unofficial group. And it's kind of an interesting thing is that now, because of advances in medical science, a good number of people reach old age. But back then, reaching old age meant that you probably had some wisdom. You probably did something right. I mean, not to take, although it was J. Vernon McGee that said that, what is it? He said, so many people think that they're going to get wisdom when they grow old, but mostly just get wrinkles. And that's true. If we don't grow old in the wisdom of the Lord, then we don't grow in wisdom just for getting older. But it was a safe bet, especially in that time. If someone lived longer, they must have made some good decisions along the way. They were certainly worth listening to. And they were the repository of knowledge. So they wound up governing the communities, is these groups of elders that would meet daily in the gates of the city. And these legal decisions were made in that place. And we get this wonderful word, behold, here. It says, and Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, right? So it's a really dramatic word. It's actually drawing your attention to something, is that Boaz shows up, and it's this interjection pointing out something that you want to note, and that is that this Goel, the Redeemer, the close relative, walks right up to him. Now, he certainly could have expected that, but we're kind of seeing another kind of quiet instance of the Lord directing things together. So Boaz didn't have to wait all day. He went up and sat there, and behold, here comes the guy. Here comes this other close relative, and you don't know what to make of him yet. Is he going to be some kind of villain, some kind of helpful person? Is he going to be a weasel of some kind trying to squeeze this situation for what he can get? We just don't know. But we know that it's all in Boaz's initiative at this point. And so as Boaz is approaching this situation, we want to note that he does seem to have a desired outcome in view, and the way that he deals with this is really tactful. So we can take a quiet lesson, if you like, from what we'll call the Boaz method of trying to get things done. The first thing he does is he makes a friendly invitation to sit down, right? He says, come aside, friend, sit down here. Now, I want to note that while Boaz is certainly older than Ruth, he's probably not as old as this closer kinsman. Now, the reason why we would say that is that Elimelech would be quite old, right, being the husband of Naomi and traditionally older than his wife, right? The person who is going to be closer to Elimelech, genetically speaking, is probably going to be older than Boaz. So you get this idea that you kind of, if you were to line it up, you'd have, Elimelech and this other kinsman redeemer, this other Goel here, and then Naomi at a certain age, Boaz probably slightly younger than that, and then Ruth much younger than that, probably in her early to mid-20s, just in general terms. So it seems to us that, so then he goes and brings 10 witnesses to judge the matter. So the first thing that he does is he addresses this guy in a friendly manner. It's kind of funny that Dale Carnegie, in his kind of landmark self-help book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, it actually is filled with these funny little tips that are so simple. And one of his most powerful ones is just smile. You have no idea what a positive impression you can make on people just by smiling. Now, currently, we live in zombie land, and no one can tell if you're smiling or not because you have a mask on your face. But even then, your eyes smile. Even in any situation, recognize, even though Boaz has we're going to see a horse in this race, he has a way that he'd probably like to see this go. He was so flattered by Ruth choosing him. He was certainly expressed that he had a positive desire and a way that he'd like to see this go. He sits down and wants to address this other kinsman redeemer in a friendly fashion. And I don't think he's putting that on. I don't, by the slightest sense of of stretch of the imagination, and we'll talk about this in a minute, think that Boaz is hoping to cheat this other man out of something that he might benefit from. I don't think that's his goal at all. We'll look at that in a moment. But he has an actual positive, friendly desire. The next thing he does is brings together these 10 witnesses to judge the matter. He wants to make sure that whatever happens, that he's got other people, other witnesses around. That's a really valuable thing, especially if you're going to have an important or a weighty conversation. You notice that taking 10 witnesses would mean that he'd have it doesn't suggest that he just takes his 10 best buddies. It takes 10 seemingly neutral witnesses into the situation who are respected in the community, who can offer wisdom and advice, and we'll see how they respond in this situation. Now he describes the situation for us in 3 and 4, where he says, let's start with 2 just to make sure we got it. And he took 10 men of the elders of the elders of the city, and said, sit down. So they sat down. Then he said to the close relation or relative, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. And I thought to inform you, saying, buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants and the elders of my people. If you will redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me that I may know. For there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am the next after you. So this is a delicate situation, whether you recognize it or not. This man has an obligation. As we looked at last week, the law of Moses said that if someone was meant to redeem that and redeem both the land and the marriage of a close relative, if they were to deny that, then they would have their shoe removed, and the woman would spit in their face, and he would be known as the shoeless one or the sandalless one in all Israel. It would affect his reputation forever. So it's a delicate matter, right? This is a matter of pride. It's a matter of honor. And Boaz is showing a great amount of respect for this other person, who, again, is probably his elder in this situation. So he describes the situation saying that there's some property involved. He starts with the non-personal. He starts with the more basic, and he's essentially letting him know. So what we've got going on here, and we need to understand a little bit about the way property worked in the Old Testament economy. You see, when the nation of Israel took the land by God's hand, he drove out slowly before them the nations that had the land, and then lots were cast, and people were given property by family. So in other words, you would inherit the property that your father would have been allotted by Moses. And in this way, they would keep keep anyone from becoming too wealthy, too powerful, too oppressive, and 2, it would keep all of the names, all of the lines alive and connected to the land. And if someone were to pass away without a child, then they had to have a close relative have a child with their widow in their name, so that those lines would not disappear from Israel. And we know why the genetic lines in Israel are so important, because it would be through Israel that the Messiah would be marked and known, right? That's a big issue. It's a big deal. It was a part of the plan of God. So if someone came upon hard times in Elimelech, we get the sense that they went out and they were quite wealthy when they were leaving their situation in Israel to run away to Moab, they would understandably not just leave their land fallow, they would sell it to some other family member, some other person in the community, someone who had the wealth, and particularly right in a difficult or a hard time, they probably sold it at a good price to the buyer, and ran away. So there's property involved. But even though they'd sold it, they didn't really sell the land. They just sold access to farm the land for a certain amount of time. The possibility, first of all, was always there for the original owner, the ancestral owner, to buy that land back or redeem it, right? And the other possibility was to wait for the year of Jubilee. At the year of Jubilee, that's 7 sets of 7 years, became the year of Jubilee, in which all of the lands returned to their ancestral personages, right? Slaves went free, and various other things happened in this 49th year, after 7 sets of 7 years each. Would be the year of Jubilee. So Naomi could either A, wait until the year of Jubilee, or find someone, a close family member, to redeem that land for her. And it's important that we note that they're not redeeming it for themselves, they're redeeming it for Naomi. In other words, it's about that kinship, that connection, that friendship. And the man agrees to redeem it. This is super generous. Like, it's weird. It's a little bit weird, at least. I mean, the law is clear that he should have been the one to redeem it, that was meant to be the close kinsman, and he hadn't acted on this. Right? Some good amount of time had passed since Naomi had returned. And it could be for lack of asking, because Naomi was ashamed. It could be for any other set of circumstances that we don't know. But the man hadn't done it to date, which is why this had to be done with such tact and such care. Because Boaz did not want to go and wave this situation in his face to his shame. Hey, you should have done this a while ago. This was your job some time ago. And particularly because, again, he has a plan. He's saying, if you won't redeem it, I will. The subtext being, I want to redeem it. And yet this man, who is older than Boaz, seemingly very generous and very honorable, says, no, I'll take care of it. If she's a closer family member to me, then I want to pay for that. I want to help her out in that way. So now we hit kind of a nice observation point. You see, when we are so desperately trying to find a love story here, this is kind of a scary moment. It looks like Boaz is going to lose his chance. He's worrying because he'd just fallen in love with Ruth, and what's going to happen, right? And so we get into that drama. I don't think that's really what's going on here. I want us to consider what we've seen so far of the character and the plan of Boaz. In Ruth 3:13, when Ruth comes to him in the night and lets him know that she's chosen him, or that she's decided that she wants him to marry her, in spite of their difference in age and whatever else is going on, he says, stay the night, and in the morning, bad spelling, and in the morning, it shall be that if he will perform the duty of a close relative to you, good, let him do it. So I want you to realize something about Boaz that really is worth noticing, that really is worth admiring. Boaz seems to have two major motivations. First of all, he wants to do what's right in the sight of the Lord. He knows that he is not the first in line to redeem Naomi, and he's not the first in line to redeem Ruth as the kinsman redeemer, as the one who would continue and perpetuate the line of Elimelech. He knows he doesn't have that right. He knows he's not the first in line. And he wants most of all to do what's right for the Lord. Second, he wants what's best for Naomi and Ruth and what's going to make them best cared for. And that brings us back to point one. Him trying to weasel his way into that situation or manipulate that situation would be the worst for it. Because even if he got what he wanted, presuming he wants to be married to Ruth, he would not have done it in a way that honors God. And that is not a way that would honor Ruth and Naomi. He would ultimately, at that point, out of his selfishness, be endangering them. So maybe it is a love story, but it's a love story in the most biblical sense possible, in which Boaz puts his desire and his best good behind that of Ruth and Naomi and Ruth. He would rather see the situation not work out in the way that he desire if that is for their best good, if that is for their benefit. And so if this other kinsman redeemer is going to be able to better provide a life for them and more legitimately before God according to his law, then that's what he's going to do. That's a remarkable statement of the character of Boaz, and it's a remarkable point for each of us. And as we consider our character, are we willing to forego what is best and what is right and God's way in order to get what we want and then kind of try to legitimize it later? If you were Boaz, you could, right? It would be pretty easy. Well, she chose me. I mean, goodness gracious, she's a Moabite. I'm the best she could do, or something to that effect. Or maybe I just really do think she's super hot or something. He could find any number of reasons, right, to justify manipulating this situation. But at least as I read this text, he doesn't manipulate the situation at all. He finds the man who's first responsible, the man who has the first kind of right or bid at this, according to the law of God. He presents it in a friendly and loving manner, saying, we got to get this taken care of, and if you won't, I'll take care of it. Or if you can't, rather, I'll take care of it. So I think that this gives us a fuller and really a far more attractive picture of this story. Maybe not as dramatic in terms of the small little picture of romance that we might be trying to build, but in the larger sense of Boaz's character, we see him as quite an honorable man indeed here, by choosing to do what's right. So then he points out the other part of the redemption. It wasn't just buying the land back. Let's look at verse 5 through 7. It says, then Boaz said, On the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance." And the close relative said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. Yet you redeem my right of redemption for yourself. I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times of Israel concerning the redeeming and exchanging. To confirm anything, one man took off his sandal and gave it to the other, and there was a confirmation in Israel. So it wasn't just buying back the land, which he was very generous to be willing to do. There was something else, and that is the obligation to Ruth the Moabitess. And he specifically points it out. It's really amazing that you see again and again and again, Ruth the Moabitess, Ruth the Moabitess, Ruth the Moabitess. And every time an ancient Israelite would read that, they would hear that judgment upon the nation of Moab. They would hear that the foreigner, the unclean, the one who is not allowed in the inheritance because of their ancestral guilt in opposing Israel, in opposing God's plan, going all the way back to when they were incestuously founded as a people from the body of Lot and one of his daughters. Right? They've got kind of a rough-shod history. And so when he brings it up, he says, by the way, there's Ruth, ... the Moabitess, who you've got to take on as well, because she was the wife of Elimelech's children. She is the one who is able to bear an heir into this situation and continue or perpetuate the name of Elimelech. Deuteronomy, let's just flip back to Deuteronomy 23:3 and hear what that other Goel, that other Redeemer, would have heard when he said, "Oh, but you must also redeem Ruth the Moabitess." Deuteronomy 23:3, which we have looked at in the course of this study, but it is worth looking at again. 23:3 says, "An Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of his descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet me with bread and water." Now, we want to point out, and this is a part of the reason why this is so important, is that David is not 10 generations out from Ruth. Well, that would be problematic, except for the fact that it's clearly the male patronage that is in view, first of all. And second of all, we've seen that Ruth is not being portrayed just as a Moabitess, but as a convert, that she's actually a proselyte into the Jewish faith. So she gains this new status as a proselyte. However, even though she is a proselyte, this would make things very complicated for this other Goel. This would be kinsman redeemer. He might already have been married. Again, older than Boaz. He might already have grown children of his own that have inheritances of their own based on what he had inherited, and thus marrying another woman, providing another heir, would complicate his own line and his own situation. And it was set up. The fact that she was a Moabitess would make it even more difficult for him. And so he finally says, that would just complicate things too much. Why don't you redeem this situation? And so the deal is made, and the official way that this deal is made is by exchanging a sandal, which is kind of interesting because obviously the procedure that was given in the book of Deuteronomy and previously that we looked at in previous weeks was meant to humiliate the person who was unwilling to sacrifice in order to provide offspring for the name of his brother, right? It was considered a reprehensible thing. So she'd come, the widow would take the sandal off his foot and spit in his face and say, "This is the one. This happens to the one who is unwilling to perpetuate the name of his brother." Whew. Pretty shameful, right? Pretty rough. But what we see is that this is actually a beautiful application of that law. And so they don't go through the shameful part of the situation, but rather just exchange the sandal as a symbol, as the marker, right? We might sign a contract or whatever it is. I'm not totally convinced that this custom wasn't put in place by the sandal makers. Just a great way to make an extra buck. Every time, it's kind of like Halloween and the candy companies. Like somehow a dirty deal got done, or Hallmark and Valentine's Day. There's definitely some There's definitely some black financial magic going on there. Anyway, never mind that. The deal is made. They make the agreement. And there was much rejoicing. Verses 11 and 12 tell us. 11 and 12. There we go. No good. Here. And all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. The Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel. And may you prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this young woman." This is kind of a really interesting poetic benediction. So the idea is that the people get around and are speaking these blessings upon them. There's a joyous occasion. There's essentially a wedding that is going to happen now, a union. The first thing we note is that there's witnesses to this affair. It shows us the great importance of doing things, especially things that are important publicly. Keeping things above board. I mean, we could extend this to why our church finances are a completely public affair. We don't want any sort of private, hidden chance for dishonesty or subterfuge or whatever would be dishonest. So whether that's finances or various other affairs, there's a value in doing things out in public where people can see, especially important things, to make sure that it's known that everything's above board and everything's going right. Then we look at this great blessing. This blessing is really interesting. It says, "We are witnesses." So they claim, we saw it, it's true, it's established, you can't go back on it, it's done forever. Someone once said that weddings happen in public, so it makes it harder for the guy to weasel out of it later. I don't know if that's true or not, but in this case, it's absolutely true. It's going to be impossible at that point if the Goel were to meet Ruth and say, "Wow, she's actually really attractive. I want to go back on that." Nope, couldn't be done. So they're witnesses, and they speak this great blessing. First of all, they point to Rachel and Leah. So Genesis 29:16 starts that story, goes on through Genesis 30, and we'll just gently kind of go over the details of that. So, of course, Jacob meets Laban, decides to work for him for his daughter Rachel, right? The first, the beautiful or the strong-eyed, I guess, Rachel. And yet Rachel is the younger daughter, so Laban tricks Jacob, and he essentially marries him off to Leah rather than Rachel. So now all of a sudden, Jacob's in a really difficult situation because he served 7 years for Rachel, and now he's married to a woman that he didn't choose, that he didn't like, and goodness. Laban's incredible solution is, "Hey, just serve me for 7 more years. I'll let you marry my other daughter as well. Why shouldn't you have both of them?" Like, that's a really weird thing for a dad to say. I don't approve of that fathering at all. I don't think the Bible does either. But now we've got a bad situation turned into a worse situation, right? I mean, that wasn't great, having to be married to 2 wives. It's never the ideal in Scripture. It happens tragically, and God seems to permit it or allow it, but he never approves it. He never suggests it. It's not his desire for mankind. And yet, here you've got this man is married to 2 women who are both sisters. Can you imagine the rivalry? The painful frustration. From Leah's perspective, she had him first. And whether or not it was all above board, she didn't have much of a say anyway. Her dad virtually shoved her through the door of the tent on the wedding night and said, "Hey, guess what? This is going on." She probably wasn't a party to it in a willful way at all. And so now she has this husband, as most people did in the ancient world, who they didn't choose. They just moved on to a situation that was thought to be best for everyone in the community. And then Rachel comes along behind and steals her husband. But from Rachel's perspective, Jacob and she had been in love for quite some time, 7 years, while he served for her hand. And so Leah was the encroacher. It's just a miserable situation. And then the great baby battle starts. And they start popping out kids like there was no tomorrow. And then they start enlisting the maids to get in there and pop out kids like there's no tomorrow. And this whole situation of tension and frustration cuts through and makes at least an uncomfortable domestic situation. It's just rough. It's remarkably rough. But it's exactly what God used to build the tribes of Israel. God used a difficult and uncomfortable situation to bring about a situation of prosperity that otherwise wouldn't have happened, right? If it hadn't been for the rivalry between Rachel and Leah, would the 12 tribes of Israel have come across? No, at some point, Leah'd go, oh, that's enough. But because of this difficult situation, because of this tension, the Lord's plan to redeem the world through the nation of Israel, the foundation was laid. So it has to do with God's promise and his promise through, again, a tough situation. Then they ask for, or they pray for, or bless them with prosperity. And others, they want them to have strength in Israel and fame. This word actually is the word korah, it means to be called. To be called, or your name will be known. The idea is that people know this wonderful story of redemption. And then the next person, and we'll go back to Genesis 38:29, the next person who's mentioned is Perez. Now, we'll come back to this in next week's study as well. But it's a cool other story. You see, Perez was one of the twin sons born to Judah through Tamar. And Tamar was a tough situation as well. You see, Tamar had been married to Judah's son, and her husband, had died. And so she was attached to the family. She wasn't free to go marry anybody else. She had to wait for another heir to come in and marry her, but Judah wasn't particularly excited to force one of his other younger sons to marry Tamar. So Tamar was totally hung out to dry. Culturally speaking, historically speaking, she was not going to have, at least from her perspective, anyone to fulfill or care for her in her old age. And so she does something that is certainly not morally approved, but she goes out and pretends to be a harlot and she is impregnated by Judah himself, and while he doesn't know that it happens, I don't know all the details of how that actually worked out, and I really don't want to. It's one of the questions we won't probably ask in heaven. But however it happened, he didn't realize that it was her, that it was Tamar. And then when it was found out later that she was pregnant, she'd still kept his signet and his cord and said, I am pregnant by this man. And in so doing, Judah showed his best character in admitting that he was wrong and that she was right. That she was right to do this. Judah says in verse 26 of 38, he says, she has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah, my son. And he never knew her again. So this is the only time that they came together to provide an heir for her, because he was essentially, out of his own desire, holding out on what was due her by this custom. And then it goes on, it says, and it came to pass that the time for the giving birth, and behold, twins were in his womb. And so it was, when she was giving birth, that the one put out his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread and bound it on his hand, saying, this one came out first. Then it happened as he drew back his hand that his brother came out unexpectedly and said, how did you break through? This breach be upon you, Perez. Therefore his name was Perez. Afterward, his brother came out and had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. So it's a really interesting situation with twins, and these twins being born. And we see that what is being dealt with is the seed line of the Messiah, right? We knew that the seed line of the Messiah is going to come through Judah, and now we find that it's going to come through Perez, right? Perez, not Zerah. And so we see this picture going all the way back to this time. In other words, the community knew that this was the genealogy to which they would be attached. And this would be the Messianic genealogy. So we have another two situations that by any account would look like they were pretty rough situations. Rough for everybody involved. Even bordering on the undesirable, kind of more embarrassing family histories. You know, every family has its secrets. The stories that only get told when all the family's in town and when no one's visiting. And so they pull up these two important examples of the times when God brought something great out of difficult times, difficult decisions. Both comparisons involve tough situations that turned out for good. It's a pretty cool point. This is the line of the Messiah that no one knew was in peril. Yet God was overseeing every single step. So, something to think about this week as you take this study into your week. Naomi, Boaz, and Ruth were all in the hand of God. God never let go of their situation. It looked dark, it looked bleak. Things seemed shaky, fearful, unsure, but God never released for one moment. God's plan would not be outstripped even by the disobedience of Elimelech and Naomi. He knew what line the Messiah would come through. And even though Elimelech and Naomi had rebelliously moved off to Moab, he would not be stymied. Even though Naomi would seemingly almost lose her faith entirely and blame God for every hardship that she endured because of her own faithlessness, God still would not his plan would not be stymied. And that's good news, because God has a plan for your life as well. Do you know what it is? I do. And you do too. Romans 8:28 says, we know that all things work together for the good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he predestined, these he also called. Whom he called, these he also justified. And whom he justified, these he also glorified. What a powerful passage. This is your future. This is the destiny that God has set out for you. He will complete by his own power. He's working all things. He doesn't call all things good. He works all things together for good. Can we see that in the life of Naomi? You bet we can. Here she and Elimelech are running from the discipline of God, running away from what they should be doing, which is trying to be a part of the solution and draw Israel back to God. Instead, they run away. Here they're in the messianic line. It should goof that up. It should cause them to overlook or pass over them, but it didn't matter. They're part of God's plan. And so even though there were some horrifying challenges of losing the three most important men in Naomi's life, and probably Ruth's as well, even though it involved going back to her hometown in shame and humiliation and need, even though it involved sending her daughter-in-law out to beg, it still was all worked together. And Naomi said, call me Mara, right? Call me bitter, because the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. I went out full and I came back empty. And she's still bitter and embittered. What's the Lord going to do? Not because of her greatness, but in fact, in spite of her great ungratefulness, in spite of her lack of faith, in spite of her desire to blame God for everything that went wrong that she brought upon herself, she's going to be full again. Isn't that a picture of the grace of God on an undeserving sinner just like you or I? So the story gives us a great opportunity to look up to Boaz and Ruth. It gives us a lovely picture of redemption. But I think the person whom I most identify with is Naomi. I'd like to believe that I was the faithful one, but I think most of us, at least at some point in our lives, we will lose faith. We will ask God why. We will wonder if we missed it altogether or if God's given up on us entirely. We will identify more with our sufferings, our sorrows, and our losses than we will with his wonderful promise. But that won't stop his promise, because he is the faithful God. Let's close our time with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you and praise you for this wonderful word, for this truth, for this account. Lord, that you loved these two women so much, that you moved the situations, the people, the events around them, so that your will would be done, so that when the man after your own heart, when your chosen first king of Israel, first fully legitimate king, David, came, that his blood would be filled, or that his veins would be filled with the blood of a faithful Moabite who chose you, who chose to trust in you, showing us that you came to redeem all the earth, of every tribe, tongue, and nation. Lord, we bless your name and pray that you'd be glorified in our lives and our ministries going forward. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.